A number of weeks ago, Ben Shapiro released a short video on the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, my channel is not involved in the political side of YouTube, but when it comes to late antiquity, this is where I come into play. So, Ben notes at the end of that, quote, "The Roman Empire teaches us that no civilization, regardless of its power and influence, is immune to decline if it fails to uphold the principles of responsibility, civic virtue, cultural integrity, and freedom. It's incumbent upon us to learn from history, to strengthen our institutions, and to foster a society that values freedom, resilience, and relentless pursuit of truth. By doing so, we can ensure that our legacy is not one of downfall, but perhaps of enduring greatness." End quote. And that is an excellent point, and his video does raise legitimate problems faced by the Roman state. It's just that those points either don't apply to the end of the Roman Empire, or are actually wrong. Rome is usually a stand-in for the problems you think are present in modern society, especially the fall of the Roman Empire, and modern society, in a Western context, usually means America, and that subtext bleeds through pretty heavily. So, taking that quote as my cue, especially the relentless pursuit of truth, I want to examine why the Roman Empire does indeed end. And essentially what that means is that we're talking about the breakup of the Roman economy above and beyond anything else, and going along with that is the decay and eventual destruction of the Roman imperial tax system. So that video is broken into 4 sections: economic, governmental, environmental, and social. And it contends that the economy of the Roman Empire was a heavily centralized one, where some emperors initially were okay with permitting aspects of the free market, but that later emperors clamped down on this, began exploiting outlying areas for tax revenue while granting subsidies to the imperial center, and then the debasement of the currency over centuries eventually forced the military to begin collecting taxes in kind, further exacerbating economic problems. Taxes were raised on the wealthy, the economy was increasingly reliant on slaves for labor, because wage labor would have required a free market, and Diocletian's price edicts did not work, and then the barbarian invasions were a result of an unhealthy economic state because it was unable to defend itself. He then quotes Bruce Bartlett as saying that, quote, "In the end, there was no money left to pay the army, build forts or ships, or protect the frontier." And then to deal with these issues, Emperor Diocletian divided the empire into 2 halves, west and east, but it backfired because it created a rivalry between the 2 halves, and the Western Empire especially had a series of problems revolving around affluence, laxity, and debt and credit problems, which gave it less room for error when dealing with the barbarians and environmental problems owing to centuries of deforestation and soil depletion, which led to a decrease in agricultural productivity. The end result is that, in 476, the Western Empire collapsed. To get the easy thing out of the way first, Bruce Bartlett is not a historian of ancient Rome. He specialized in modern American history, writing a master's thesis on Pearl Harbor in the 1970s, and he has since worked for various Republican administrations and politicians, and has written books about modern American diplomacy, politics, and administration. So in other words, he's not a specialist on late antiquity. Victor Davis Hanson is also quoted, but since 2004 or so he hasn't really been involved in academic debates and he's turned toward political commentary. That is to say, the sources backing up the video are not exactly cutting edge. With that in mind, if anyone wants to do further reading, the academic sources I've used for this are listed as always in the video description. Now for the more difficult side of things. There are, broadly, 2 positions on the Roman economy, especially in late antiquity, that scholars take, and those are the primitivist and the modernist views. Dealing with this subject is extremely difficult. It is true that the Roman state did not have a conception of economics as its own field, and that the Roman administration did not fully appear to understand what inflation was, but characterizing it as a system that was divorced from the free market, where taxes increased on the wealthy, and which was characterized by a high degree of slavery, especially in late antiquity, is basically wrong. And this is where the 2 views come into play. The primitivist position really focuses on how the economy of ancient Rome was fundamentally different than the economy of the globalized world today. Studies that take this position focus on the behavior of Roman elites in that they placed a great deal of emphasis on social status and basically rent-seeking behavior, instead of something like venture capitalism. On the flip side, the modernist position focuses on how the ancient and modern economies were fundamentally similar, hence the name of this viewpoint, the modernist perspective. To a large degree, the economy of ancient Rome was governed by basic economic rationalism, price-setting markets, and the easy movement of goods within a unified commercial zone connected by the Mediterranean Sea. The Roman state had a complex system of banking, credit, and debt markets, which actually was the cause of a few market crises over the course of Roman history, and a vast corpus of contract and commercial law. Arguably, the major difference between the Roman economy and ours is that it was not industrial, although it did have large centers of manufacturing, especially for goods like pottery, and the Roman economy was undercapitalized. But the Roman economy was also one that, for an agrarian economy, was extraordinarily complex. Farming was an extraordinarily profitable industry that was well integrated into the broader economy as a whole, and the archaeological evidence tells us that agriculture and its associated industries, like viticulture, were market-oriented. When it comes to slavery, well, in the period we're talking about, slavery appears to have been falling by the wayside as the basis of the economy. Now, this isn't to say that the system was abolished and that slaves were not ever used in late antiquity. Far from it. Slaves were still used, and they were used heavily. But the heyday of Roman slavery was between about 200 BC and about 200 AD, because this was the era of massive estates, or latifundia, which depended on slave labor. In late antiquity, by contrast, estates began to shift away from slave labor and towards the use of the coloni, free or semi-free peasants, who legally became tied to the land. You could look at this as the beginning of what becomes serfdom in the medieval period, and Roman landlords became increasingly interested in taking rents from their laborers either in actual taxes or in kind. In other words, the slavery argument isn't really accurate, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. When it comes to the inflation and the debasement of the Roman coinage, though, this is a bit harder to deal with. For about 200 years, the Roman state had a bimetallic currency, the silver denarius and the gold aureus. The ratio between silver to gold was about 25 to 1. Now in 64 AD, the denarius was debased by 10% by Nero, and then Trajan debased the denarius in about 100 AD by 5 more percent, reducing the overall silver content to about 85% on average, but this doesn't really alter the standing ratio of 25 to 1. When Marcus Aurelius came to power, it was debased to 75%. Under Septimius Severus, it gradually became debased even more to about 50%, and then Caracalla came along and he did two things. The first thing he did is that he reduced the gold in the aureus, which had not been debased by that point, but he does so only slightly. He also introduced a new coin, the Antoninianus, about 2/3 the size of the denarius. So why does he do this? What was going on? Unfortunately, we don't have as many records surviving from the Roman world as we would like, but the best estimates for the imperial budget in the 2nd century AD is something like 1 billion sesterces. It's a smaller Roman coin, basically the ratio is 4 sesterces to 1 denarii, and in the 2nd century, something like 70% of that budget went to the military. This budget was not balanced, and expenditure routinely exceeded tax revenue, although extra money did come into the state coffers through plunder and war, and through massive silver mining in places like Iberia. But there seems to have been a problem with those mines, and the silver deposits began to be exhausted in the 2nd century. The solution then was to debase the silver and not the gold, because the denarius was the basis of the economy, while the aureus was used for more specialized transactions. The Marcomannic Wars, fought between 166 and 180 AD, almost bankrupted the state, so with the supply of silver drying up, the currency was debased basically to about 50%, and this is probably what explains Caracalla's actions as emperor when he comes into power in 198. He introduced a new gold coin, and he expanded the citizenship drastically in order for the state to have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of new citizens who would owe taxes. It's not entirely clear, but out of all the emperors prior to the crisis of the 3rd century, he appears to be the one who best understood what was happening and actively tried to fix it. The Roman economy was a fundamentally monetized one. They didn't just utilize coins as some sort of abstract representation of value, They actively thought in terms of profitability, labor, and productivity in monetary terms. The state and the economy almost broke up in the 3rd century, and in some ways it's a miracle that it didn't, but the situation did stabilize, and it's due to 2 factors. The first is that the composition of the civil service actually changed. Prior to the crisis of the 3rd century, the Roman system functioned by co-opting local elites into the power structure. After the 3rd century, this was no longer the case. The aristocracy changed from one of birth to one of service, and it drastically expanded. It effectively made it easier for the emperors to govern by reducing the burden on their shoulders and spreading it out, with the result that long-term, the bureaucracy had a vested interest in keeping the Roman state going because they now got something out of it: prestige, power, and most importantly, money. Which leads us to the other thing that changed. The economic historian Gyrus Benagi once remarked that, quote, "In the late empire, gold came to circulate at a floating rate." This essentially means that the whole monetary system in the late 200s and the early 300s fundamentally changed. There basically was not any sort of attempt to tie the bronze, silver, and gold coinage that was circulating together. It allowed for further credit expansion, and it allowed for the monetization of the Roman economy to expand drastically, and this is what we see in the late 4th century. The economy, and thus the state, was far more integrated than it was previously, and the state began to recover. We have plenty of archaeological evidence that informs us of new towns being built, urban construction picking up again, and the future of the Roman state looked fairly bright. It really would not appear to a citizen of the late 4th century that anything was really that wrong. Indeed, there's little indication that anything bad at all was going to happen. That is to say, there's no indication that the Roman Empire was going to disappear. The basis of wealth shifted from land to money, and land became profitable so long as it generated money. Hence the attempt at market rationalization of estates in the Roman world, and the desire for taxes and revenue-producing coloni as opposed to slaves. There was a massive expansion of agriculture and industry, for example, in North Africa, because olive oil, which you can grow in North Africa, made lots of money. So this is the major challenge. Things seem to be picking up and the state recovered from the problems of the 3rd century. So then how, about a century or so later, did the Western Empire essentially disintegrate, while the Eastern Empire continued to prosper? Well, on the one hand, you have environmental and climate change, the Roman warm period, a series of centuries which had unusually warm temperatures, came to an end in the 4th century, and as a result, the climate shifted. It's not that soil was overused or forests were chopped down. That did happen, but it tended to be localized, with the Romans actively practicing forestry conservation and burning olive oil waste as a substitute fuel, so much as temperature shifts stopped allowing for excessive crop yields, which formed the basis of Roman prosperity. Beyond the climate problems, the best answer to this question, why does the Roman Empire fall, comes from the work of Chris Wickham, and to paraphrase a section of his book, Framing the Early Middle Ages, the Roman Empire was indeed a state, which stands in contrast to the territories which took its place, especially in the fact that the Roman Empire was a complex state, unified geographically by its proximity to the Mediterranean Sea, and fiscally and territorially united by its tax system. Upper-level officials calculated the revenue needed for the fiscal year, and sent out the numbers to the governors in the provinces and cities. To move that money, as well as the taxes in kind for the army and grain and olive oil and other resources for the Annona, the city of Rome's grain distribution system and Italy's system more broadly, as well as for the military, which was arguably the major driver of the economy, ship owners were contracted, the holds were filled, and they left their home ports, and after discharging their tax cargo, they could go anywhere else and essentially get a tax write-off. While these things don't survive archaeologically, what does survive are thousands, probably millions of pieces of pottery. In some places, like Britain, it was locally produced, but it still spread through the whole province. But in many places, it was produced in one area and shipped across the empire, much like many of the goods we have today. Roof tiles and other ceramic building materials too were mass-produced, and they were used in construction all across the Roman world. which, whether we think about it or not, led to healthier homes because it kept decay and insects out. The economy was unified by large estates and a web of complex markets, in many ways not unlike our own interconnected economy, and in the 4th century it appears to have been a very healthy one. But by the middle of the 6th century, the former territories of the Western Empire began to undergo what medievalists termed radical material simplification. Red slipware, a distinctive type of pottery made in North Africa, often serves as a proxy for assessing distribution and Roman economic health. In the 6th century, its distribution shrinks drastically, and essentially the economy unraveled. More than anything else, what did in the Roman Empire was the seizure of North Africa by the Vandals in 429. From the province of North Africa came much of the grain and oil which fed Italy, especially Rome, and which also supplied much of the Western Roman military. And this province was also the wealthiest one in the West. It was also one end of the tax spine in the Western Mediterranean, the other one being Italy. The Vandals were one of many groups of barbarians who entered the Roman Empire in this period, and really there are 3 views on them and the destruction they caused. The first is that there was mass migration in a short period of time. The second view is something more along the lines of an elite transfer, and the last is that there really wasn't any movement at all, just a gradual diffusion along the frontiers spanning decades. Now, all 3 views are correct depending on the situation and on the group being examined. The seizure of Africa was a violent affair, and although the archaeology does not show the Vandals as a materially distinguished population, the written sources we have describe mass incidents of molestation, especially of nuns, the wanton killing of priests, and the torture of civilians to uncover hidden loot, such as stuffing feces down throats, twisting cords around foreheads until they snapped, and of course, flaying. By 442, though, the Vandals had married into the imperial line, and at least for a time they supported the Romans, attempting to join the system, something that most of the barbarians in late antiquity wanted. In 455, though, due to the murder of Emperor Valentinian III, the Vandals sailed to Italy and they burned and sacked Rome. The extent of this event is not fully understood, and we have differing accounts of the severity of it. What matters, though, is that with the loss of Africa, Rome was starting to feel the pinch of a weakened economy, and the crucial tax spine between Spain, North Africa, and Italy, which unified the Western Empire, effectively broke. This is the key difference. The tax spine for the Eastern Empire, which connected Egypt to Anatolia and then to Constantinople, remained intact. Not in the West. And with rapidly decreasing tax revenues, the formal structure of the Western Empire was split up into smaller semi-barbarian kingdoms. A spiral had started, which, with the failure to militarily reconquer North Africa after the defeat at the Battle of Cape Bon in 468, essentially proved impossible to stop. The state ran out of money because it could no longer collect taxes to ensure its healthy functioning. Now, the empire did not end in 476. There's actually a large push among historians to move the end of this state to the 530s and the 540s due to a series of massive wars undertaken by the Eastern Emperor Justinian in an attempt to reconquer the lost Roman provinces of the Western Empire. If you are looking for a major breaking point, the point of no return as it were, where you can clearly see a Roman world on one side and a distinctively medieval world on the other, the 6th century, not the 5th, that is to say not 476, is where you should look. So when did the Romans think that the Roman Empire fell? The same with the barbarians. When did they think that this was gone? Well, essentially when they said it fell. We have very little evidence to suggest that states like the Ostrogothic kingdom, which was based in Italy, or the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia, did not see themselves as Roman. Their law codes did make a distinction between Romans and Goths, that is true, but the people living there still saw themselves as living in a fundamentally Roman world and in a fundamentally Roman context. Indeed, King Theodoric of the Ostrogoths appears to have actively styled himself as a Roman emperor, and many of the Roman aristocrats supported that move. Justinian, however, needed a pretext for conquering what were still understood to be Roman lands and Roman people, and the basis for that justification became the ousting of Romulus Augustulus by Odovacar in 476, and the removal of the last emperor of the Western Empire. The Western Empire, then, in Justinian's framing, had indeed fallen, and the Romans were coming to take it back. This created a mental break in how people living in the territory of the former Western Empire understood their place in the world. A Roman emperor, the only one, had dispatched an army to conquer them, labeling them as barbarians and not Romans. The failure of these conquests and the devastation that they wrought broke the mental and ideological framework of the time. And the failure of Justinian's wars created the conditions under which the idea of Rome, and with it the empire, was truly gone.